This is the final in my 6-part sermon series called I Know You Are, But What Am I? Someone asked me recently about that title. When I was a child, of course, we learned to respond to verbal attacks from another child with a sing-song incantation. I know you are, but what am I? I know you are, but what am I? And today I smile at the notion that I am part of a faith tradition whose adherents often find it easier to explain what they do not believe than what they do. We are like a support group, Religions Anonymous. I was raised Baptist. I'm a recovering Catholic. I used to be Jewish. We have UU pagans, Christians, Buddhists, humanists, atheists, social activists, and the undecided. I know you are, but what am I? The living tradition we share draws from many sources. Sound familiar? First among them, in our UUA bylaws, direct experience of that transcending mystery and wonder affirmed in all cultures, which moves us to a renewal of the spirit and an openness to the forces that create and uphold life. What a fantastic sentiment. I saved it to the last because I think it is the first and final authority for our chosen faith, whatever that faith may be for you. Thousands of tired, nerve-shaken, over-civilized people are beginning to find out, wrote John Muir, that going to the mountains is going home. That wilderness is a necessity, and that mountain parks and reservations are useful not only as fountains of timber and irrigating waters, but as fountains of life. Some of the days I have spent alone in the depths of the wilderness, he said, have shown me that immortal life beyond the grave is not essential to perfect happiness. For these days were so complete, there was no sense of time in them. They had no definite beginning or ending, and formed a kind of terrestrial immortality. Even the economist Joseph Pine said in his TED Talk, "You cannot have an inauthentic experience." Sheltered and secure in my homegrown faith, I entered Stetson University as a junior in 1973, on track to becoming a Baptist minister. How unprepared I was for the challenge of academia. What I learned at Stetson was that I knew nothing about religion. I remember a professor one day, statistics of all classes, asking us how many students believed in the literal truth of the Bible. Stetson at that time was a Southern Baptist school. I was one of several hands. He then predicted that half of us would leave the school as atheists. Turns out I was one of his statistics. 2 years of studying religion, reading the great theologians of Europe, biblical criticism, all of it challenged the beliefs and implications of my fragile faith. Until in agony and desperation, I went before the dean of the religion department. Dr. Walker, I said, I feel that my faith is under attack here at this Baptist institution. Dr. Walker replied with some degree of sympathy, if you feel that your faith is under attack, then it is a faith which needs to be challenged. I muttered and stumbled and fretted and went on with my studies, completed my degree, and all the while my foundations were shaking. I couldn't stop thinking about what Dr. O. Lafayette Walker had said to me. I struggled as I watched the pieces fall away from my religion. First, it was the inerrancy of the Bible. Turns out, it was written by human beings. Who knew? The accuracy of the accounts came into question, and the role of God in all of it. And if Jonah wasn't swallowed by a fish, and Noah didn't build a boat for every species on the earth, then what about the New Testament? The miracles of Jesus, the lordship of Christ, the supremacy and truth of Christianity itself. But in the course of time, I came not only to appreciate, but to embrace my theological studies. I went on to Southern Baptist Seminary, an atheist, and continued for 3 years to follow the course laid out ahead of me. By the time I arrived in Louisville, Kentucky, I had made a pact with myself. I was going to peel off all the layers of my religion, my beliefs, my understanding, everything I had been told and taught since childhood, until I came to bedrock. Until I could stand firm and say, this I know from personal experience. My life since that day of reckoning has been immersed in one tremendous learning experience after another. Long before I ever heard the phrase, follow your bliss, I knew somehow that life and its adventures were meant to be experienced on their own terms. As long as we live with integrity and honesty and love toward others, then everything which moves us is a gift from God, a sacred endeavor. Life is not measured by the breaths we take, but by the moments that take our breath. Theodore Parker, one of the most remarkable Unitarian ministers in our history, made a commitment to his Roxbury congregation that he would, quote, preach nothing as religion that I have not experienced inwardly and made my own. And David Park, in his book, The Epic of Unitarianism, called Theodore Parker an intellectual giant, a commanding preacher, an emancipator, second only to Abraham Lincoln in stature and influence. In 1851, Parker addressed a meeting of the Boston ministers on the subject of the fugitive slave law, requiring Northerners to turn over runaway slaves. Parker had such people in his congregation, and he admitted to taking them to his house on occasion, quote, to keep them out of the clutches of the kidnapper. He said, I have had to arm myself. I have written my sermons with a pistol in my desk, loaded and ready for action. This I have done, he said, in Boston, in the middle of the 19th century, much as we would say in the 21st century today. I have been obliged to do it, he said, to defend the innocent members of my own church, women as well as men. Theodore Parker's religion was a lived experience. In his famous sermon on the transient and permanent in Christianity, he called the Christianity of Jesus a simple thing, very simple. It is absolute, true, and pure morality. The only form it demands is a divine life, doing the best thing in the best way from the highest motives. It does not demand all to think alike, but to think uprightly. Not all to live alike, but to live holy. God, send us a real religious life, he prayed, which shall pluck blindness out of the heart and make us better fathers, mothers, and children. A religious life that shall go with us where we go and make every home the house of God, every act acceptable as prayer. End quote. No matter the source from which a person draws, Christian, Jewish, humanist, pagan, our spiritual development is centered finally in our own life experiences. Religions and philosophies mean nothing if they do not speak to us personally, if they do not draw from or investigate the meaning of life right here where we are. As I read somewhere, it doesn't mean a thing if you don't get dirty. In seminary, I began to study Buddhism and Taoism and other Eastern philosophies. I sat for an hour every day in meditation. I read every book on Zen that I could lay my hands on. In one of those books, Dr. Reginald Blythe wrote, "It is a rather humiliating discovery to realize that all these years of effort and turmoil have been spent in a state of slumber. That from our earliest memories of childhood, we have been half asleep and acting with only partial awareness. We have been hypnotized," he said, "by the nature of words, alienated from ourselves and from the universe." When I left seminary in February 1978, my life was in disarray. I was an aspiring minister without a church, denomination, or faith. My father was dying of cancer. It felt like all of my experiences and preparations were for naught. I wandered through a wilderness of job prospects and living experiments. I had a minor in psychology. I carried it to FSU and enrolled in a master's program in social work. I tried that out for several years as an alternative to ministry. It didn't take. It was not my calling, Annie. But it too was a life experience. Over and over in my life, I have stumbled upon that precious serendipity of events, the pieces of my life that seem to merge and meld and fit together when I follow that simple formula of faith that Parker talked about. Preach only what I have experienced and made my own. It's happened in so many ways. As an underclassman, I studied math just because I loved it and no other reason. I was a religion major. And then I ended up for 34 years with a custom carpentry business to support my ministry. I was a Baptist, but I studied Eastern philosophies, which later would be vital in meeting the strict requirements for the Unitarian Universalist ministry. And when I finally walked into that UU church in Jacksonville in 1987, and I heard Reverend John DeWolf Hurt, a former Baptist, preach, and Mary Claire Vanderhorst got up to announce a civil disobedience being planned, I knew I was home. Today we stand upon the threshold of a new religious movement. Perhaps, more honestly, we should label it an anti-religious movement. The current leaders of our association are loudly and eagerly calling on us to prepare for change. Not because we welcome it with open arms, but because if we do not prepare, then we will be run over and left behind, as the other mainstream churches are discovering. Pope Francis said, instead of being just a church that welcomes and receives by keeping the doors open, and you can't get more open door than this, let us try also to be a church that finds new roads, that is able to step outside itself and go to those who do not attend, to those who have quit or are indifferent. I prefer a church, Pope Francis said, which is bruised, hurting, and dirty because it has been out on the streets, rather than a church which is unhealthy from being confined and from clinging to its own security. I do not want a church concerned with being at the center and then ends by being caught up in a web of obsessions and procedures. As UU minister, the Reverend Teresa Cooley said, fear is not the reason to change. Wanting more people to call themselves Unitarian Universalists is not the reason. The reason to change, she said, is so our values, that love is stronger than hate, that each of us has worth, that we will find truth and meaning if we search, can be a real force in a world that desperately needs those values now. That's why I do this work. Direct experience of that transcending mystery and wonder that moves